Morning, everyone, to Association of Indian Research Scholars 20th webinar on a topic that is so interesting that we have received an overwhelming response from the participants. It is a topic which I think is significant because in hindsight, we should always look at and try to understand our leaders because we can learn from their weaknesses and strengths. And today we are fortunate to be hearing about such a significant prime minister of our country from an authority, I think, who does not need an introduction at all. But before we do that, before I go into the introductions of the speaker, let me ask Ajab Rangunwala, a graduate student at St. Francis College, Begumpet, to give us the progress of Association of Indian Research Scholars. Over to you, Ajab.
Association of Indian Research Scholars, also known as AIRS, is the brainchild of the President Ariba Ahsanat Mausam. It was created to bring together like-minded, intellectually inclined, and enthusiastic research scholars of our generation. It aims to collectively increase the knowledge base through interaction with the best minds in the world. So far, in the past 1.5 months, we have been able to provide passionate discussions with Professor Muazzam Ali, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Rajen Harshe, Professor Arun Patnaik, Professor Alfredo Toro Hardy, among others. The aim of this association has been to provide a platform for young scholars to connect with experts where they can have stimulating and interactive sessions with them. We have not only brought on the grades on our platform, but have also managed to start the Young Scholar Lectures series with Artika Ganguly's lecture, Coolies in Indian Literature, Understanding Colonial History and Modern Slavery, but also have done our first book discussion on the book China versus the US, Who Will Prevail by Professor Alfredo Hardy. The focus of the month of November has been on relevant topics with regard to social sciences research. We have been looking at the concept of war and warfare with 2 lectures. The first by Nuno Rodrigues on psychological warfare, theory and practical implications. The second lecture is an enticingly new topic, outer space warfare challenges, theory, doctrine, strategies, and tactics, which we had on the 22nd of November. AIRS is available on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, Telegram, as well as has its own site, airs.org.in. Thank you. Over to you, Akiba ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ajab, for succinctly giving us that progress. Now let me introduce the speaker. Today we have with us Professor Shanta Sinha, who is an academician, was a HOD and a professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. She gained internationally renowned 2003 Ramon Magsaysay Award for Community Leadership. She has also been awarded the Padma Shri in 1999 and the Albert Shankar International Award 1999 from Education International. She has been awarded with Hyderabad Women of the Decade Achievers Award for social service. A rights activist, her contribution to a phenomenal reduction in child labor in nearly 50 villages of Rangareddy district in Telangana is perhaps unparalleled. For this, she has also been appointed by the government of India as the first chairperson of the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights. Unfortunately, when I was in the department, I never had the chance to sit in ma'am's class, and it has always been my dream to sit in her class and learn from her personally. So I think this is an opportunity to sit with ma'am and learn from her today. So with this, I invite ma'am to take over and please enlighten us and give us her insights on the topic. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ariba, and I thank the Association of Indian Research Scholars for giving me this opportunity to engage with some of you. I chose to speak about Indira Gandhi and her prime ministership, basically, as Ariba just mentioned, that to see what we can get on the basis of hindsight. I think hindsight is a very useful way of understanding her and her contribution or her weaknesses. I will not be very social scientist kind of a framework, but I will try my best to give you as much information as I can, and maybe we can leave a lot for discussion as well. Uh, on a personal note, let me tell you, that is when she did declare emergency in 1975. One was in the university doing PhD in JNU, and one had witnessed how several of my friends were all arrested. There was a mood of fear. So that is one personal experience I have had with the mood of the times during 1975. But more importantly, I think where I did really benefit from what she had contributed to India's development and growth was when I was engaged with, as all of you know, talking about children and their rights. And that is when we found that 40% of children were actually bonded. The only act one could use at that time to release children from bondage was the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act. In fact, it was passed during emergency, and if that act was not uh, enacted at that time, I don't think I could have done much in terms of release and rehabilitation and rescue of children from bondage. So, in a way, I owe a lot to Mrs. Gandhi and the emergency and the law that she passed to take that forward to get children from out of work into school. So I start with these two. The fear of emergency that we've had, one was witness to it, but at the same time, how one could utilize some of the provisions that enactments that were made in the emergency period, the same period that brought fear, the same period brought certain enactments which enabled several of us to, in fact, uh, get children and the labor force their entitlements. So it is a contradiction in terms, in a way. And I thought it was something that I could share with you. Along with it, of course, to look at her prime ministership from the time she became a prime minister as a prime minister who was weak, as a prime minister whom they really called was dumb, a doll who would make no difference at all, and a prime minister who can be malleable, who can be manipulated. So the reason why she was made a prime minister was not so much because of dynastic politics or that she was Nehru's daughter, as much as that she can be, in fact, uh, uh, manipulated by the right wing in the Congress to do what they thought was best for the country and its future. So, in a way, I think uh, I would like to talk about the early stages of her prime ministership, how she established herself. Then, from there, I would look at her economic agenda, which was basically left wing, up to the period of 1975. After that, I would focus on the emergency and what the thrust of her work was on emergency. Then finally, I will try to summarize what I think she was as a leader. I am not going to cover the period of her prime ministership, which was also quite significant between 1980 and 1984, but I will stop at emergency itself because I think that gives us insights into both Indian politics as well as how important the role and function of a prime minister is in a country like ours. As I just told you, when she became the prime minister, she in fact was anointed as a prime minister after Lal Bahadur Shastri's death in 65. So in 1966, she became the prime minister. The condition in India was not at all favorable at that time. India had already fought two wars with China and with Pakistan, and that itself was very debilitating as far as the economy was concerned. We hardly had food reserves. There was almost famine situation and a drought situation. We were borrowing from US, and in fact, that reserve was also dwindling, and Mrs. Gandhi was taken over power when there were hardly any food reserves. The balance of payment was also nil. In fact, there were only some 200 crores of rupees in terms of foreign exchange. There was stagnation, there was inflation. In fact, the condition was really appalling appalling. So this was the kind of a situation. There was hunger, there was poverty, and glaring inequality, injustice in the country. So this was the kind of a situation that she had become the Prime Minister of India. And she had to, as an emergency, first of all, tackle the issue of food. I'm sure all of you know about the food crisis and how, when she did go to negotiate with the US government for food, they had started putting on conditionalities of dispersing food on a installment basis, which was very, very unreasonable. And the reason they did that was to put pressure on India not to criticize US presence in the Vietnam and to support US imperialism in Vietnam. This, of course, Mrs. Gandhi was not willing to do. She was not willing to compromise on the rights of people in Vietnam. She was not willing to be pro-US on the genocide that they were having in the violence, the war they inflicted on the Vietnamese, and therefore she decided that she will not compromise on it and she would not accept the terms and conditions. That is when she felt that if India has to develop, if India has to be independent, if India has to be self-reliant, in fact, that was the agenda of Nehru as well, you will have to be self-sufficient in food. And for this self-sufficiency in food, she had to go ahead with the Green Revolution. And we know what is happening today in contemporary India, where a new class of farmers emerged in certain sections of the population. We are seeing that in Punjab today. I will not go into those details, but to just tell you that it had made India self-sufficient in food production because of the thrust it gave in terms of green revolution. And that I think is a phenomenal contribution she made, and it had such a impact that she also established herself globally as a no nonsense prime minister, not as a prime minister who would sort of succumb to pressure, but who would look at national interest in an ethical framework of liberty and freedom, that she would, you know, follow again the policies of the earlier prime ministers who would stand by liberation movements, who would stand by people's rights, and who would stand by, say, the movements in Africa. So the same politics continued, saying that we will support anywhere justice and against human rights violation. I think that that message was so clear. So apart from tackling the food crisis, I think she established herself as a person who stood for human rights, and that I think is very significant. Now, soon after in 67, there was a general election, and all of you know that the general elections in India in 1967 was something kind of a disaster for Congress. It did not have the same kind of majority as before. So she, in fact, became a prime minister of a very weak parliament, a very weak majority. And states had opposition parties who have first time formed governments. In many states, regional parties formed government. I'm not going into the reasons for why they emerged, how they emerged, but certainly I think it was a period where the Congress was at its weakest. So she became a prime minister. She ran the elections in 1967. She was a prime minister. She was a Congress prime minister, but then it was a defeated prime minister. In the sense, although she formed a majority, I'm not going to the statistics. I have numbers of how many seats they won, how many seats they lost, and how many state governments had opposition parties. I wouldn't want to get into the statistics. I will break into the thread of what I'm talking to you about. But then it seemed that she was on a very weak wicket. Now something had to be done. She had to also establish herself as a prime minister in her own right. And this, I would describe this as an internal coup. She had a coup against the Congress to establish herself as a Congress leader. And that is where she had to. Uh, 1 second. Sorry. I mean, I had to do some internal emergency problems. Yeah. So, what I would like to say is that she had to assert herself. And I think the period of assertment comes when she, in fact, announced a 10-point program in 1967 through the Congress Working Committee. And that 10-point program, in fact, did talk about the nationalization of banks. You all know about it, where it was a private that were controlling the banks, but it had to be brought under the public sector to make it more inclusive and to see that it reaches out to many more, especially in the unreached, untouched areas of the country. So, in a way, I think a nationalization of banks sent a message that she is going to expand democracy in India. She is going to embrace all those areas where the state has not reached, nor has the market reached, where monetization has not taken place to the extent it should have, where there has to be facilities. So it was a huge structural intervention that she made in terms of nationalization of banks. And we see the result of it today. I mean, about how so many sections of the population got integrated into the state as well as the market with her nationalization of banks. The other example is of course, that of abolition of privy purses, where the erstwhile princes were so much uh, taking from the treasury maintenance for their empires which were no longer there. So I think this was also a symbolic act saying that, look, we are no more going to nurture and support feudal uh, lords, but we are going to be a democracy in our own right. So in a way, the message slowly started coming that she is for a different agenda. He's for radicalizing India's democracy. Now, this would be called a left wing agenda. I would call it a radicalizing India's democracy. And I say radicalizing India's democracy in terms of defining, there are many definitions of democracy, and all of us know voting right is a good definition, political participation is a good definition, having representation is a good definition, having civil liberties is a good definition. But I would say having uh, equality, having inclusiveness, having embracing populations who are marginalized and giving them equal opportunities and chances is a very important aspect of democracy. And she emphasized that aspect of democracy, which included equality. There is no way in which you can talk about democracy without talking about equity and justice. And that is where I think her trust of democracy came. And she said that she would sort of expand the base of democracy through some of her programs. And that, I would think, is an aspect of marginalizing those vested interests within the Congress who are quite cushy and who in fact had a right wing, not cushy really. I'm not denigrating them. I'm saying that their emphasis was much more on the market, but she continued with the Nehruvian framework of state support, but then with very clear emphasis on democratization of India's economic policies and social policies. So that, I think, is the crux. But what is more important is that she really established herself by taking a strong stand against the Congress party itself. The Congress, there was a vacancy. I mean, there was a need to elect a new president. The Congress party had put up its own candidate, Sanjeev Reddy, as a president. And she again was very firm that she must establish herself as a radical Democrat. I mean, that's not the word she uses, but I'm using the word for her, that she decided that she should put up a candidate and ask the constituencies to vote on the basis of their conscience. For the first time, a conscience vote. And the candidate was B.V. Giri, who was a very well-known trade union leader and straightforward person who also was a member of parliament, who was also governor, who was also Congress person, rich experience, but seen as a person from the working class movement, and it was significant that he got elected as a president. Now, for breaking the discipline of the Congress party, the Congress party actually decided to expel her. That is when she started her own party called the Congress R, and which claimed the history of the Congress and its continuity. Somewhere, the other Congress was marginalized, and she claimed the entire history of the Congress. She invoked the past and she established herself as a leader of the Congress party. And that is where I talk about it as an internal coup. She was not in the, they expelled her from the Congress. She conducted a coup against herself, in a sense, and she established herself. And I think that was a very, very important, demonstration of her not being the kind of a doll that whom they thought she was. They thought a woman, a prime minister, she could be manipulated, but somewhere she could not be manipulated. And she took principled stands every time to get out of a crisis. She used a crisis as an opportunity to establish herself as a leader of the people as a whole, and not of a particular class. Now, that I thought was very, very important. And then I would go into some of the significant aspects of her economic agenda once she established herself as a leader, which I think is important. Uh, and it was a continuation of, as I told you, the May 1967 Congress Working Committee. Uh, 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 you know, uh, I will not go into the details, but I think, as I mentioned to you, one thing that she did was that she tackled the food crisis, and she pushed the Green Revolution strategy. It began to pay immediate dividends. By 67 to 68 and 1970 to 71, food grain production rose by 35%. Food availability continued to increase sharply to 110.25 million tons in 1978 and 128.8 million tons in 84, and we were blessed with surplus stocks. So I think this is a very, very major contribution of her investment in the farmers in the Green Revolution, where India was made self-sufficient in food. The other policy initiatives, which are very, very important, but they seem to be mundane, but I think they are so important. That was her focus on women, unemployment, rural development, youth and students, the sports, scholarships, wildlife, environment, you name it. There were a series of commissions, series of studies and reports which led to policy concerns on a wide range of issues, again expanding the democratic base of India's policies, India's society. Now, something that all of us knew was about the report that she had on women, which was chaired by Veena Majumdar. And that was the first time women's equality came to the fore. In fact, one of the consequences of this was an act that was enacted on equal remuneration for men and women as far as wages were concerned. Then she had a National Commission on Education in 1972. I thought what you have to look at is the thrusts of the policies. The focus, the areas that she focused on is very, very important. Then there was a National Commission on Agriculture in 1970. Then there was an expert committee on unemployment. Then there was a task force on integrated rural development in 1971. There was also a focus on youth in the Estimates Committee's 79th report of the Ministry of Education. There was an expansion of scholarships for students, and there was, as I told you, establishment of Nehru Yuva Kendra, Nanak Bhavan's National Integration Scheme. All this culminated in the fifth plan document. If you want to see a real break from the past, in this kind of expansion, you would see that the statement of what kind of India she was looking for and what she had planned for is so clearly expressed in the fifth plan document, where clearly India was not to be seen as a begging bowl and that we were capable of taking care of ourselves. She also decided to focus on public sector, a continuity of Nehru's program. There was already a trend to do less of public sector, but the investments in public sector was so important. In fact, it yielded results. And by 1980s, you find that our growth went up. We were known for the phenomenal Hindu rate of growth, which never crossed 3%, but which went up to 5.68%. So in a way that, uh, I think her expansion of this, also she expanded enormously the scientific and technical capacities of India in the frontier areas, like in nuclear science. The expenditure on science and technology increased from $1 million to $1,450 million by 1984. Our stock of scientific and technical manpower increased more than 12 times, from about 190,000 to 2.32 million between 1949 and 1977. The Pokhran nuclear test in 1974 and launch of Aryabhatta in 1975 were the testimonies to the advances we made in nuclear and space research. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the phenomenal jump that happened during her regime, because normally one doesn't talk about these aspects of her regime. And then we also, I think, have to look at how the Northeast, you know, was all under one state, Assam. But in 1972, she granted statehood to Meghalaya, Manipur, Tripura, and then made the NIFA, the Northeast Frontier Agency, in Arunachal, which subsequently became the state of Arunachal Pradesh. So she granted statehood. In fact, she granted statehood to divided Punjab, Haryana, and Chandigarh during her regime. So in a way, she brought out huge structural changes in terms of governance as well. More importantly, I think, is the issue of the war uh, uh, and the great victory that had come through the Bangladesh, the war with Pakistan. I would rather not call it a war with Pakistan, but a war that supported, again, the people of Bangladesh, liberated them from the genocide of Pakistan, and in fact showed that a nation need not be based on religious identity. A nation could be diverse, it could be based on linguistic identity as well. Religion need not be the identity for creation of a nation. I think that comes out very clearly. More than that, I think it showed how she stood firm, and the foreign policy experts would be able to throw more light on it than I would, on how she established against odds the supremacy of India. She fought the pressures of US, she fought the pressures of China. She in fact had to sort of even uh, get the Soviet Union to her side, enable them to take a strong stand. And finally, she stood with the people of Bangladesh and got them liberated from the genocide of Pakistan. And I think that was the biggest victory, I would think, that Mrs. Gandhi had. And she was riding at the crest of her popularity during that time. And it's so important to look at that. So it is this kind of a popularity that she had, where even the opposition praised her. You had Vajpayee calling her the goddess Durga. She was at the height of her popularity, and it is so important that in 1971 he decided that she should go in for a midterm poll. So after 1967, between 1967 election and 1971, she established herself as a leader. She showed the promise. She showed how she could take control both internally and in terms of foreign policy. so much so that she was already recognized as a leader by all classes. What she wanted was a legitimacy to her, because she didn't want to govern on a weak parliament, but wanted people's support for her next innings. So she called for a 1971 elections based on her successes, and she won with a thumping majority. I think the significance of 1971 poll is important for us because we are in the political science and business of looking at it, is that in a way it was the first time there was a break in the rhythm of electoral politics. Earlier, every 5 years, an election was held. There was an election in 52, then 57, then 5 years, 62, then 5 years, 67. The next election should have been in 72, but she held it in 71. And so it was something like a plebiscitary politics. She, the politics was to get support from the people and their acceptance and for legitimacy, for consent, uh, not as much for representation. So, in a way, legitimacy and consent became very important aspects of electoral politics, which was introduced by Mrs. Gandhi. After that, you find that one can't predict if the elections will be held every 5 years. There has been a disruption and it is continuing to be disrupted. I will not go into the detail, but I might just tell you that she introduced the element of plebiscitary politics or the element of consent for leadership. And that I think is very, very significant. Uh, uh, I mean, we can always discuss the positive aspects of it and the not so positive aspects of breaking the rhythm of politics. Now, one would expect that now that you have won an election, you're riding high, that there would be political stability. You know, that you could continue with what you have introduced between 67 and 71, and with that stability, take India forward to the next level. What is it that happened? That there was total political unrest and instability, which required to be handled by her, and where she felt insecure. I think that, in spite of the majority she had, she did feel insecure at that time. And I think one will have to go into a bit of some description of what was happening at that time. From the 60s onwards, India was in a grip of student unrest. As she also recognized that there was unemployment, there was a youth unrest, and many of the youth did join the extreme left wing or the Naxal politics of the Naxalite movement, and it spread like fire in most of the places in the country. Let me tell you, this youth movement is something that happened not just in India, but it was a product of the times, the mood of the era. You find that the youth movement was in US against the war in Vietnam. The youth movement was in France. The youth movement was in Latin America, and South America. So that was a global mood where the youth unrest became so widespread. And in India too, it had its roots in the states of West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, Bihar, Punjab, in these kinds of, in these areas, where they fought for the youth as well as the peasantry, joined together. They fought for rights of the tenants, the sharecroppers, the rural workforce, and also the tribal population who were totally marginalized. They were also inspired to be part of this movement. While this was happening, there was also the oil crisis in 1973. Prices just shot up, and this exacerbated uh, the kind of what does one say? Uh, the mood at that time. You find that George Fernandez, in fact, a renowned socialist leader, he went on to a railway strike, which in fact hit at the core of India's democracy, and it shook it. the working class strike, especially the railway workers strike, which had support of other movements as well. During this time, we also have the Jayaprakash Narayan movement, who in fact supported the movement in Gujarat, uh, the Nirvan movement in Gujarat of the students there, as well as Bihar. So you find that the kind of situation that there was really coming to a boil, in spite of the fact that she had attained uh, uh, I mean, a majority. There were many other factors, and uh, what this, in fact, triggered. And here, I would like to sort of talk to you about the declaration of emergency and under this kind of a political background. Now, the trigger to her declaring emergency in 75 was the court judgment, which barred her from contesting elections and holding any position for 6 years for misusing the government machinery. In fact, I mean, there are details of what the misuse was about. If you compare it to the misuse that is happening in contemporary India, you wonder whether it was actually that kind of a misuse. She used Yashpal Kapoor, one of the bureaucrats, and she also used some jeeps belonging to the government. Here you have helicopters going left and right, but but it did make her very vulnerable. She appealed to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court also upheld the Allahabad court judgment, but allowed her to continue as a prime minister, to participate in proceedings of the House, but she was forbidden from voting as a member of parliament. So the refusal of the Supreme Court to grant an unqualified stay on High Court order offended Mrs. Gandhi the most. But what happened was this triggered a call by the opposition saying that here is a prime minister who has been disqualified by the Supreme Court of the country. And so she's not, it's illegitimate. You know, she cannot be the prime minister of the country when the court has asked her, has said that she broke rules. There was a call by Jayaprakash Narayan, who urged people to organize protests demanding her resignation as a prime minister. Then there was also an appeal to the police and to the army and to sort of not uh, not abide by any orders issued by a government by a prime minister who's not very legal. So, in view of these protests and constant pressure uh, and the law and order situation at that time, he imposed the emergency in June 1975. It lasted for 21 months and ended in 1977. Now, I will sort of uh, look at what provoked Indira Gandhi, in her point of view, to do something like this. And this I gather from some articles written, and it is actually very difficult to gauge the threats to India's democracy as perceived by Indira Gandhi when she declared the emergency. Uh, the Total Revolution movement of JP, with support from RSS as a backbone, uh, demanded the resolution of parliament and state assemblies and resignation of MP, MLAs, and of Indira Gandhi, as she was turning to be an authoritarian leader heading a corrupt government. It appealed to police and armed forces to disobey orders. For Indira Gandhi, the demands posed a threat not just to her or Congress party, who won the parliament and assembly election by substantial majorities in consonance with the letter and spirit of the constitution, but to the spirit of parliamentary democracy itself. That is how she kind of justified it. So, while calling for emergency, one would say that what happened subsequently has been some of the darkest days of India's democracy and India's polity. And I would like to run through them before I go into The other aspects of emergency, which I spoke to you about, how it radicalized democracy to bring equity and justice to the forefront. Now, first of all, as you know, it curtailed civil liberties. Now, 50,000 activists were immediately arrested and put to jail. You had important leaders like Vajpayee, Morarji Desai, Charan Singh, Vijay Raja Scindia, Jaitley, Sitaram Yechuri, Prakash Karat, hordes of RSS activists were all arrested. Many of them were forced to go underground. Then, so this I think was something which nobody would accept even today. Then also, she censored the press. In fact, she passed 3 acts which were later on repealed for uh, empowering her, giving her teeth to censor the press. And this was the Prevention of Publication of Objectionable Matter Act, Parliamentary Proceedings Repeal Act, and the Press Council Act. And of course, they were repealed by the Janata government. Other than that, I think during that time, her son Sanjay Gandhi played a major role in sort of bringing about far more authoritarian pressure on the people. And he was actually seen as the extra constitutional authority. And the assault on poor through sterilization, raising the huts to the ground in Delhi, are all very well known. Then there was a MISA that was passed, Maintenance of Internal Security Act, a controversial law where you could arrest without warrants. Then there was, as I told you, a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion, and one would think of this as a scar on India's democracy. And in fact, I would think that in her losing the election in 1977 was a punishment for her excesses during emergency. In fact, she was also punished by being sent to jail after this for her excesses during emergency. But I would rather go into the laws and policies during emergency at that time. Now, I just want to know how much time I have. Yeah.
I have around 20 to 25 minutes.
Oh, good. Oh, good. That's a lot of time, I must say. Yeah. Now, if, as I told you, the idea of democracy is one of justice to the last person, the rural laborer, the urban slum dweller, the bonded laborer, the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribe community, the women, small and marginal farmers, the shelterless, then it found expression in the 20-point program that was announced as a policy during that time, at the time of emergency. The thrust of the 20-point program was an attack on poverty. In fact, I forget to tell you that the 1971 elections was won on the basis of a slogan, Garibi Hatao. And that continues even during the emergency time. There were many at that time who thought that she stole the agenda from the left wing. This was the agenda of the radical left wing, the Naxals. This is what they were talking about. In fact, Indira Gandhi stole that agenda. One would say that she had that agenda. Her means of attaining this was through parliamentary democracy and certainly not through the kind of politics of uh, uh, and armed struggle. So, in a way, I think the thrust of 20-point program was an attack on rural poverty. What it meant was, in concrete, there was a second wave of land reforms. And I think this was very important. It gave rights over land to the scheduled caste, to the Dalits, and for the first time they became property owners, landed property owners. Then they were also given through the rural development programs, through the nationalization banks which penetrated in those areas for access to credit, for access to investment in those land, to make possible those lands to produce some yield. In fact, we have this economist Raj Krishna who said that it introduced small farmers as a class uh, who could command more productive assets and inputs per unit of land than large farmers. Now, it had a radical impact. For the landless Dalits, apart from land, it also it gave them house at the homestead. They could, and I think this is also very, very important. It also gave them an independence. You could produce your own food grains. You don't have to be dependent. It is like getting them out of the clutches of the rural farmers and the rural employers who could sort of bind them to work against credit. So in a way, I think it made huge difference to the Dalits. This I think is a very, very important legislation. There could be a criticism. There were criticism that the kind of land that were assigned to them, were given to them, were bad land, which could hardly be cultivated. It was only stones and rocks. But I think the symbolic value was far too great. And those who could cultivate did cultivate. But then the sense that you have become a peasant, you're not a laborer, but you're an owner of a land. But you have an asset, you have a property, you can negotiate with it, you can engage with it, gave a sense of ownership to the land as well as to the country, that they matter. I think that was a very, very important connect Mrs. Gandhi made with them. That I thought was important. I would go by the other legislation, which is the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act. I think it was I do not know how many of you are familiar with this act. You know the issue of rural indebtedness. You know how the poor had to borrow money. They had to sort of, even for their basic survival, they had to live on credit from the farmers, and the interest rates would grow. And sometimes it is one generation after next which got tied to the landlord. This attached labor system was broken with this Bonded Labor Act. What did the act say? The act said that you cannot be forced to work against the loan that you've taken. It is against constitutional values. Constitution talks about freedom. It doesn't talk about unfreedom. So nobody can force anybody to work because you've taken a loan. You either give a loan and forget it, but you don't force a person to work. And all the loan that you've given so far stands cancelled. The person who's bonded need not repay the loan. I think that was a very significant, in a way, it touched the poorest, the weakest in the country. If one would say that democracy is to reach your laws and policies to the weakest, it is the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act. There cannot be a person poorer and weaker than a person who is enslaved. And here there was, by the act, an freedom to so many of them. Now, apart from this, I think there were many laws and acts she passed in favor of the working class. I think, again, she had the BD Workers Act, BD Workers Welfare Fund Act. She had the iron ore mines, manganese, chrome ore labor welfare fund and the act. And in fact, the Equal Remuneration Act, where men and women workers have to get the same wage, was also passed during emergency. So you find, it's interesting, all the acts that I just talked to you about the land reform, about land to the poor, about bonded labor, about credit to the poor, about equal remuneration about workers' participation in management, there were deep structural issues, addressing deep structural inequalities. And she had the courage to break the status quo, to go ahead with an act that will break the status quo. I often wonder if these acts could have even been passed if there was no emergency. You know about the vested interests, you know about the class background of people, you know about the kind of pressures that can operate. And if there was no emergency, I wonder if the voices of the poorest could have been heard by the parliament at all. and it is a hypothetical question, of course, but I still think that the poorest were heard, and she established a direct connect with the poorest. I still recall that when she passed away, when she was assassinated, the poorest wept in the country. Some of them had a 10-day ceremony. And here I was working in the villages around. They even tortured their head as if their own mother died among the Dalit families. So that is the kind of personal connect that she had with them. I think the best was the 42nd Amendment. And I thought I won't do the whole thing, but read out the preamble to the 42nd Amendment, which is almost the voice of Mrs. Gandhi. She says it is therefore proposed to amend not she, it is a 42nd Amendment uh, preamble. It is therefore proposed to amend the Constitution to spell out expressly the high ideals of socialism, secularism, and the integrity of the nation, to make the directive principles more comprehensive and give them precedence over those fundamental rights which have been allowed to be relied upon to frustrate socio-economic reforms for implementing the directive principles. It is also proposed to specify the fundamental duties of the citizens and make special provisions for dealing with anti-national activities, whether by individuals or by associations. Now, here I think, when you look at the bill, the 42nd Amendment Act had it was for the bill. It was said that for socio-economic revolution, subsequently they made it reformation. But this is a curious pattern. Look at the vocabulary and the mood of the times then. It was so easy for those in the establishment, for those in the government to talk about revolution in a constitutional document. So I think it's important. So basically, what I'm trying to say is during emergency, the thrust was to bring about as much change in structural inequalities as possible. You know, taking advantage of the situation of course, loss of certain democratic rights in terms of civil liberties. There was a gain in terms of establishing certain laws which continued. And I think it is very important to flag that. The criticism, of course, of Mrs. Gandhi, I would like to go about to 4 or 5 points before I conclude. First of all, she was instrumental, I think, in deinstitutionalization of politics. She appealed directly to the people, bypassing all institutional processes of governance. In fact, she would not even go through the state governments and the chief ministers. She would go directly to the people, which I think she has been criticized for. She had no faith in her own Congress party and its capacity to take forward a radical left wing agenda. In fact, she had no uses for the bosses of the Congress party and its organization to even fetch votes. She had to fight an election battle on her own. And you can see how it weakened the Congress party, and you can see the long term impact of the party by establishing a direct contact with the people. In fact, the party would not even internalize the radical reforms she brought about because they were so bypassed. So you find that the Congress party even today does not claim anything that I just spoke to you about in terms of what she did for the poor. Now, many a times with rumblings of class tensions and opposition, the scheme got diluted. It defeated the very purpose and gave critics the proof that they were right after all. In fact, Indira Gandhi was criticized for introducing mere rhetoric of radicalism and populism for the sole purpose of survival in politics and not necessarily meaning to eradicate poverty. It was denounced as being ineffective, the poverty alleviation program, and that it was just a announcement, sloganeering without actually being implemented. I think it was also a period where there were beginnings of psychophancy, corruption, and criminalization of politics. When you don't have institutions, what you have come in its place would be sycophancy. Then, of course, encouraging Sanjay Gandhi as an extra constitutional authority and not stopping forcible uh, sterilizations is one thing. Then we have talked to you about the declaration of emergency and civil liberties at stake. But I just highlight the 80 to 84 term as a prime minister. I think the handling of Sikh politics and consequent is something that is worth talking about, but I will leave it for now. Then the nexus she had with the corporates during that time. Actually, the nexus she had even with Dhirubhai Ambani, with the Jindals during that time is something that I would not like to touch upon, but that came at the second phase of her prime ministership. And yeah, I would say these two come out very clearly. Let me conclude by how I look at her. This will take about 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Indira Gandhi established herself as a formidable leader away from the glory of nationalist movement. During the first decade after independence and until the 1967 general elections, Congress party drew its strength from the legacy of nationalist movement and the Nehruvian vision of democratic self-reliant India through mixed economy. I think Indira Gandhi was really the prime minister of independent India in terms of giving a thrust in terms of the context of independent India, not drawing upon the background of nationalist movement. She gave a new dimension to the Congress party in the context of post-independence India with focus on dignity of the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, the workforce, the small and marginal farmers, women and unemployed youth. This eventually became the program not just for the Congress party, but the nation as a whole. No political party could ignore this agenda. They had to make it part of their manifestos. And even today, these are the agendas on all political manifestos. Even those who opposed her had acknowledged the significance of her pro-poor agenda. The notion that poor matter to India's democracy and it is a state responsibility to bring about change, no matter what, was dinned into the national consciousness. Her imagination of India is best summarized in the speech she made in Orissa the day before her assassination. I'm sure you have all you know about it, but I'll just read out some excerpts from the speech, and that's how I would like to end today. I mean, I think it's so important because when we are talking so much about nationalism, we must know what kind of imagination she had about India's nation and what kind of India that she was looking for. Some of these are exports. I directly quote from her. The hands of men and women, old and young, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, people belonging to backward castes, indeed of everybody who's living in India, should be strengthened. They should have the courage and they should have the strength which will take this country along the road of development. Another quote: without economic equality, without equal opportunities for all, freedom could not be considered complete. If there are acute inequalities in society, the gap between the rich and the poor will widen, resulting in increased tension and class struggle. We have to take to the masses our programs regarding education and healthcare, particularly to those areas where people have been victims of social and economic injustice for centuries. This must be remedied. Another quote: I have four more quotes. If we remain prisoners of superstitions, if we continue to quarrel among ourselves, if we tolerate communalism, do not fight against it. If we let casteism or regionalism develop and grow, or if we start quarreling in the name of language, how will we able to preserve the unity of India? If unity is not preserved, how will we protect our independence? Do not think that if we have one freedom once, we will able to preserve it for all time to come. In a way, one has to nurture India's freedom, one has to nurture India's diversity all the time. It is a constant agenda, continuous agenda. Then the next is, if agitations coupled with violence are launched and people hate each other and the opposition parties encourage such agitations without considering the long-term effects on the social fabric of our country, then we will not be successful. All of us must think how much pain, agony, and hardship it will cause to a countryman. And in the end, she talked about fighting superstition, bringing about scientific temper, committing to modern science to service of people. And this, she said, was a dream of our freedom movement in which every section of India participated. The last, I'm sure you've heard this, but then it is so telling, as if she had a premonition about her death. She said that she would be proud to die serving the nation. I am alive today. I may not be there tomorrow. I shall continue to serve until my last breath. And when I die, I can say that every drop of my blood will invigorate India and strengthen it. Even if I died in the service of nation, I would be proud of it. Every drop of my blood will contribute to the growth of this nation to make it strong and dynamic. And that is Indira Gandhi. For you, my friends, it is for you to sort of take what you think is sound and uh, uh, appreciate, criticize the legacy that she left behind for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a very insightful lecture. Things that I found and realized so many things that I didn't know previously. Though I have heard of how the villages used to celebrate her visits, because of charismatic personality, I never realized that she had done so much in terms of welfare during her emergency. We always in political science usually hear about how an emergency was imposed and how constitution was breached, all these technical aspects of it. But to be able to realize and understand her as a leader who wanted to do so much for her people, and in terms of health and bonded labor, freedom, liberty, the consciousness aspect of it, I think I like the words that you use, especially the how citizens even got the right to vote consciously. They were not motivated or swayed by a political party or a leader. She's appealing to the masses to think for themselves and consciously vote, realizing how much power each vote has. And thank you for sharing the reforms that you work for. Her mass appeal that you have discussed with us has given us a lot of food for thought.
Thank you.
With this, I would like to ask the questions that have come in from the participants. The first question is by Rutam Udgata. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. He wants to know that when we talk about abolishing laws related to bonded labor, shouldn't there have been a more robust process that ensures the investors got their due? Wouldn't ruling out the status quo completely in favor of underprivileged be counterproductive to an extent where they stop receiving support from the privileged? Would the said steps not be looked on as means of appeasement rather than upliftment?
I think it's a very, very interesting question. Thank you for asking this question. And let me tell you that how it has to be resolved is the politics of it. Laws can't uh, even talk to you about the strategies for implementing it. Laws can just state in black and white, and that's what laws are about. And the politics of implementing it, how do you counter it, I think has to be worked out by state as well as civil society. What the act does sort of anticipate so many problems in implementation. It is I can do a whole lecture on the bonded labor system abolition act, but let me tell you that it has anticipated all that you said, and it has provided for relief for every kind of counter that the poor can face in the process of implementation of the act. So I think that is important. But if it is not, getting a right act itself is a huge struggle. Getting a rhetoric itself is a huge struggle. Sometimes we constantly criticize something for being only a rhetoric, but to get only a rhetoric is also not easy. To get the establishment to say what people like to hear is also a huge battle, and that I thought you must understand. If the voice of the people become voice of the establishment, that is one step. Then again, the voice of the establishment has to be translated into action through politics. That is the real step. But without an act, the second step cannot be done.
Thank you, ma'am. That is, I think, answers the question very well. We have received another question. Okay. The same person says the laws can only be black and white. It's the politics that will take care of the implementation. You have beautifully summed it up, and she wants to thank you again for that.
Yeah, no, I think he's correct. Laws have, if they're not black and white, then they can't be effective. Gray shades don't make effective laws.
We have been joined by Professor Rajan Harshe, and I would like to invite him to ask a question. If
Oh my God.
on the,
Thank you, Rajan, for coming.
No. I'm just hearing what she has to say. Look, students participate. I'm just hearing.
okay, sir. I think the questions are almost done. We did not receive many questions. People were so engrossed, and actually, this is a topic that very rarely people talk on or deal with in political science, even in our classes. So I think people were more keen on actually understanding what it was rather than coming up with questions. They really didn't have a background, I feel, because we have many participants, but all of them are just listening and are, pretty dazed and interested at how things change. And ma'am, I was wondering if that is how, does it take emergencies and working alone to get things done? Because in the way it was narrated, it felt as if until and unless you take things in your own power, grapple, and you don't, the system does not help you get things done. So she had to actually, in the way it was narrated today, I felt as if she had to take things head on, sing individually. She had to, take it all by herself. She had. So how do you see this in
I think it's a brilliant question that you've asked,
in a
Arima.
leader? Yeah,
How much there is of a role of a leader
leader.
and a role of an individual, and how much of it is systemic. I think it's a really a very important question, and that has to be studied. The context is very important. See, even her role as a leader has to be in the context of the period she was in. As I told you, the period that she was in was the period of radical politics. So did she appropriate the language of radical politics? It's not only her. There were so many others who would have also internalized that atmosphere.
Yeah.
I think one cannot underplay the mood of the times, and that is very, very important. Even when you look at the unrest, when you look at the youth movements, when you look at the women's movements at the time, you look at the tribal movements of the time, if without that context, even a leader would not, I think, be able to speak that kind of a vocabulary. That's how I would look at it. Leader is important, but the leader is also in a context. But
Yes,
there
ma'am.
could be a leader who may not listen to the context,
Yeah,
who
not.
may not respond. And that is one thing. The second thing is that what you said is that, in fact, if only, and these are hypothetical questions, is there any other, you're almost asking like, was there any other way of doing it for Mrs. Gandhi?
Yes, ma'am.
And this is very hypothetical question. That our hindsight, of course, gives us answers to this question, but I would not want to speculate on it. Because you can always say there were mistakes, you could have institutionalized it, but then I would not want to work on speculation. To the extent I use hindsight to understand what happened, but not to speculate on what could have happened.
Could have happened. No, ma'am, I was asking because there is a fine line between being a
Absolutely.
and taking people with you. You're like the Congress with you, even the Parliament with you, and then taking decisions in the.
You're right. One thing that we can learn is that, which we always talk about in terms of authoritarian leadership, they require consent.
Yes, ma'am.
Either you call it legitimacy or hegemony, even to dominate, even to hegemonize, they need people with them, and they have to think in sync with the leader. It's so important that otherwise you cannot run the system. So in a way, one could be cynical and say that Mrs. Gandhi utilized all this program of were to hegemonize. But on the other hand, you can use the other concept of consent and gain legitimacy to be able to govern.
Yes.
That is one. And the third is that he genuinely felt that India's democracy required inclusion, required empowerment of those who were totally marginalized, required a democracy to be defined in terms of equality and justice as well. I will leave it to you to decide whether she hegemonized, whether she purchased legitimacy, or whether she genuinely wanted to actually democratize Indian society to make it more inclusive. That's for you to decide.
Yes, ma'am. I think the takeaway from today is that this third aspect was, I think we should really concentrate on that she worked for the masses, and that is not stressed enough when you say marginalized sections were given a chance to be included in the main. I think that is a takeaway from this lecture. Where
In
you,
fact, I didn't mention, but there's a whole book, a chapter by Jairam Ramesh on what she did for environment and wildlife, her love and care for animals, for preserving the tiger. I mean, a very versatile person. She loved art, she loved culture, she loved literature, she loved harmony. It's a very enlightened elite, I would say. And not all elite are bad if you're enlightened.
yes, ma'am.
And she was, of course, a very polished, enlightened elite. I mean, that's what she was.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for this lecture, ma'am. It
Thank
has given me given us actually to so much to think on, and go back and investigate a little more to understand.
Please,
Yeah,
please
I think
go
this was the best.
go to the portal which talks about laws and policies. In fact, I had to do that for your lecture. But I should thank you for getting me to look at all the enactments she made during emergency. There's a whole portal of the enactments from 19, some God knows, 1905 to today.
Oh
Every
my
year,
God.
how many? And it's significant. The maximum number was during emergency, some 27 of them. And all of them, most of them were pro people, except for the three on press censorship. Rest of it were pro people.
Yes, ma'am. This is what we should go and read up, because we always hear about the press censorship, but not about the other 25 that were also significant and need attention from research scholars in India. So
I think so. Right.
yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you. Thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much, ma'am.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank
Manasa Uppuluri, a graduate student at St. Francis, to please deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, Manasa.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please continue.
I'm sure you will all agree when I say that it was a true honor to hear Dr. Shanta Sinha speak. Her lucid arguments, her enthusiastic delivery, and her command over the topic, as well as her depth over the knowledge, were truly inspiring. I personally was constantly taking down notes. I thank the president of AIRS, Ariba Asnath, for conceptualizing, realizing, and bringing to fruition this lecture. I would also like to thank Dr. Shanta Sinha for taking time out of her busy schedule to join us and give us this enlightening lecture. I thank all the members who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible, making special mention of Astha Binzani, Mohammad Farizuddin, Salma Jahan, Evangeline Nonglaw, Ajab Rangoonwala, Aruna Anil Kumar, Mohammad Shebu Shaibu, Priyanka Gautam, Manasa Uppluri, and Mohammad Muazzam Ali. We at AIRS are grateful for the support, enthusiasm, and determination of the speaker, the participants, and the team at AIRS. Under the unfailing guidance of our president, Ariba Ahsanat Muazzam, this event was made possible. Thank you. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Manasa.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, and all the best to you. Use the COVID times for more research.
Yes, ma'am. That is the best advice we have received. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, with this we call the event to an end. I hope to see all of you on the next lecture on Saturday on the philosophy of education by a speaker from Sri Lanka. So I hope to see all of you there at 11. Thank you so much and have a great day ahead. Bye-bye. Manasa, if you can please post the feedback link. Thank you so much. Dear participants, you can fill the form and receive your certificates by using the feedback form that has been put in the chat box. Thank you.